Go ahead.
Perfect. All right, so I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, so can y'all see my screen all right now?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, yeah, again, apologies about the slideshow. I seem to have lost my original slides that I planned, so I just found a quick draft just to throw a title slide up here for you. I promise I'll get you some slides or some links after the fact, but thanks so much for coming, everybody. Today's talk is titled "Vimprove Your Development Environment." So obviously a very lame pun on my part to talk about Vim today, my favorite text editor and IDE that I use for code development. So just by way of introduction, my name is MJ Wojcik. I work at Last Call Media. I do manage to have an intro slide here. So as it says here, I'm a senior developer at Last Call Media. I've been working in the Drupal space for many years, probably the past 6 or 7 years, and most recently I've been working a lot on JavaScript as well. So kind of straddling that kind of PHP JavaScript realm. And there are some links that if you want to connect after the fact, I'll share these along with the actual resources after the talk. And just to mention where I'm working, my company, Last Call Media, who is, I believe, one of the sponsors of this conference, I joined them about a year ago, and it's honestly been a great working experience, and they really support having the chance to talk at events like this. And so I appreciate y'all's attention today. Just want to pop this slide up here just to give a little shout out to LCM, what we do. But with that being said, I can hop into more of what we're here to talk about today. So the inspiration for today's talk was that as a new developer, when I first started out, let's say 6, 7 years ago, I remember being very intimidated of anything on the command line. Uh, it was very scary. I was afraid I was going to break my computer all the time. But luckily, I had a few colleagues at my first job who were kind of very encouraging / I found very intimidating with their mastery of magic command line tools. And for example, using Git on the command line instead of a GUI for that, a graphical user interface. And so that's what encouraged me to start digging into the command line, getting comfortable in my terminal, and more specifically then what led me to the subject of today's talk, which is Vim as a text editor based in the terminal. So as I mentioned here, I slowly dipped my toes into more and more basic Unix commands and got more and more adventurous, downloading all of the kind of CLI command line interface tools that I could find and experimenting with different shell customizations like Fish or Z Shell. And that's what got me really into the world of then experimenting with Vim, for better for worse. So in today's talk, I really want to talk about Vim as truly a way to improve your development environment, to kind of improve your everyday workflow. So for me, the reason that this is important is because so many times I feel like a lot of folks, just like me when they first starting out, the command line something is very intimidating. Um, and it can be very scary. You're not sure where to start. And then you see someone like me pull up Vim and you're like, oh God, what is this? What is this person doing? Like, I have no idea. And it can all be very intimidating, and it can seem like it's something that's simply not worth your time to get involved in. You're busy enough. You gotta you just got this new job, you got to get this PR out right away on this ticket they just gave you. And so you're, kind of the last thing on your mind can often feel like, oh, like diving into some uh, arcane command line tools and text editors like Vim. Uh, but that being said, I think what I have found is that Vim for me as a developer has provided me with a lot of customization capabilities that other IDEs, specifically like VS Code or PHP Storm, can't offer. And so with that in mind, I'd like to speak briefly to the real focus of where I'd like to talk about today, which is the specific Vim distribution that I use, which is called SpaceVim. So it's a bit of a backstory that is maybe not worth getting into, but the term SpaceVim actually comes from the world of SpaceMax, which is an Emacs distribution. As a Vim user, I tend not to talk about Emacs myself. It's a viable option, and that being said, though, given that this is the open source world, feel like I have to give a shout out to SpaceMax, especially because SpaceVim is so obviously a riff on that that original naming. But that being said, kind of as we see here, the idea of SpaceVim, kind of speaking to that original use case of, let's say, whether you're a veteran developer just trying to look for a new toolkit, or if you've been using Vim for years and you're just wanting to check out something different. Um, how I would talk about SpaceVim is that it's a way of getting into Vim without having to start from scratch. And the idea here specifically, taking inspiration from the SpaceMax project that I mentioned already, is that uh, and is number one, ergonomics, actually, oddly enough. Um, as you might know, in Vim, one of the annoying habits is that you have to learn is how to enter simple commands. Oftentimes people joke about getting lost in Vim, not knowing how to exit Vim for 20, 30 minutes and getting stuck and not knowing how to climb their way back out. And that is because in Vim, usually you would have to uh, use the kind of command style of colon and then the command name. And so that's a bit tricky on the hands, I would say, or that's so goes the argument, at least here. And so in this case, the name SpaceMax and SpaceVim actually comes from the idea of mapping the commands actually to the spacebar and mapping your hotkeys to the spacebar as the kind of prefix for any commands you might run. And so I think what might be best is actually if I can just pull up my local Vim here, which you'll see is using the SpaceVim distribution. And so kind of like we talked about, I can zoom in my screen here just to make it a bit more legible. But as you might know, if we wanted to edit a file, usually in Vim we would type :E and then the file name to open it. In this case, I have a TOML file, a simple text file, and that's all fine and dandy. But that can be a little cumbersome. And so for an example of opening that with the kind of SpaceMax version is that you can hit the space bar instead, and that'll bring up this nice prompt. And of course, once you get used to the key bindings, you won't need this, but this brings up another concept of mnemonics and discoverability as part of these projects. So as a new user, if you just hit the spacebar when you open up SpaceVim, you'll get a nice little menu that you can kind of start to drill down into. And so from here, we can see F would open up files, for example, and then we could, if we're trying to find a file or anything like that, we can hit /, for example, and then I could start looking for different files here. With that being said, I also have I prefer other ways of finding files, and so for example, I can open up I have a kind of what you might more recognize as a usual file explorer. So here, just using a custom key binding that I have, I can hit space EF to explore my files, and that's a custom key binding I set up, and this opens up a plugin in order to open up a normal file explorer that you might expect. And from there, we can open up that same file just by hitting enter. And from there, we can get started. And so just to speak to the general philosophy there is that the defaults that they have set up are set up in a way that should be easy for new users to be familiar with. And so if you go to spacevim.org, for example, and I won't go through the installation instructions, it's pretty straightforward. They have a great quick start guide here. Installation is often as simple as literally running a single line on your terminal if you're using Linux or Mac. Just running the simple curl command and then executing the bash script to install it on your system. And then they go into a bit of details, and I can show you how to go about configuring SpaceVim for your own usage. But I would encourage anyone curious about this project to go to the documentation page, where they really have some in-depth documentation and really go really deep into the different options available, the different commands. And they have a lot of great screenshots here. For example, you kind of can see what here is potentially possible is an example of a workflow that they have here. We see a file explorer, we see a tag bar, kind of multiple windows open, kind of you get the power of Vim and the command line at your fingertips, but without having to start from scratch, without having to copy and paste someone else's Vim RC file to your machine, or not knowing where to start. So I would encourage anyone to check out that. But I think really, as anyone who is interested in command line and command line text editors like Vim, the power really comes, in my mind, in the kind of extensibility and customizability of these platforms. And so with that in mind, I'm going to go back to Vim and actually show you what the config file, the basic config file for SpaceVim looks like. And so that is usually located in, you'll end up with a directory called .spacevim.d, and you'll have an init.toml file. And so they kind of provide a lot of same defaults out of the box, but basically the idea is to make customization here really simple out of the box as well. You can, instead of having to worry about complex configuration spread all throughout, if you wanted to just play with a little bit of the options first, you would go to your init.toml file that SpaceVim installs, and you can set things like your font and your color scheme, and what shows up on the status bars here, where we're seeing we're in normal mode and the file name that we're navigating. But the real magic of SpaceVim is its concept of layers. So instead of forcing users from the start to scrounge for plugins on their own and organize them as best as they can, SpaceVim really tries to help users out with that by adding this what they call a layers feature. So we actually manage a layer. Best way to think of that is actually a collection of plugins. And again, SpaceVim borrows this from the SpaceMax distribution of Emacs, which is another open source project. But the idea is that it provides users with an easy way to, for example, if I want to work with a specific language, I can, if I scroll down here, it can become as simple as, for example, I want to add the layer with lang pound TypeScript. And so that will enable a package of TypeScript related plugins in Vim that will basically turn Vim into, in this case, a TypeScript IDE for coding. Same goes for any type of language here, like PHP, JavaScript. And the idea here is that when you're first starting out and you want to use Vim, bare bones Vim is very bare bones. You of course can customize it, but this provides an easy way for new users to dive right in. And if they want to try it out as an IDE, but they don't want to have to look up all the plugins on their own, they can come into their SpaceVim init toml file and simply add, for example, the layer JavaScript here, and that will download a few plugins, get them ready to go, have things like ESLint, you can even have things like TypeScript server running in the background, just like any other IDE environment. And so that's kind of how the basic configuration works. If we scroll down here a bit more, you'll see this is where I get into my own personal customization, where I add my own plugins from the larger community as well. Again, to me, a lot of the power comes in the extensibility of Vim and in turn SpaceVim. And so certainly Vim uses its own plugin manager in order to allow you to bring in any other Vim plugins from the larger community. And it's as simple as, again, adding just a few lines to your init toml file in this format. So this would be grabbing usually things from GitHub. So these are usually pointing to GitHub URLs. You can bring in Vim plugins from other URLs from the Vim scripts website, for example, but this is also an easy way to manage your own custom plugins out of the box, and that's very easily legible. And so this is just an example of the many plugins I've installed. So from there, what I'd like to talk about a bit more now, again, along the lines of customization, is custom key bindings. So SpaceVim, in my mind, is founded largely on the philosophy that a text editor or an IDE should be easy and ergonomic to use. And so the defaults that they provide for you are great for that. You know, having the spacebar as your leader key, and they kind of label the keys that you're going to hit to open up files or perform basic commands in a very easy to understand way. And for that, the documentation page that we saw on spacevim.org is going to be your friend in that case. But once you're comfortable, the sky really does become the limit. And so in that sense, SpaceVim is a great, to use the space analogy, a great launching pad for your own personal journey into Vim and all the fun that lies therein. And so once you're ready to dive into that world, after init.toml, where your basic config is handled, where you're going to install plugins in, your next go-to file is going to be your MySpace vim.vim file, which is also in that same config folder. And this this is my personal config file, and I'm happy to share these or anything else after the talk. I'll post links to these files if anyone would like to take a look at my customizations. It's not necessarily the best organized, but the beauty of that is you can do with it what you want. And the basic idea of the customizations here is that SpaceVim provides some basic functions that it will guarantee to call in this case before all of the plugins are loaded. So it basically, in your MySpace vim.vim file, you can have a before function being called as well as an after function being called. And usually you can put any custom configuration in the beforehand because usually you're adding in customizations for plugins. For example, you'll see if I scroll down here, by way of example, let's see, for example, I have PHP auto import plugin. So if I have this plugin that's going to help me auto import classes in PHP, I might want some custom key mappings. So in this case, I want to put those in here, and then those will be picked up by the plugin on loading. And so that goes into the before function here in the MySpace Vim file. And so I just wanted to show here, though, for example, something that I use. You might have noticed earlier how I've been opening files is I actually have a custom key mapping uh, where I can hit space H for history of files, and you'll see all my recent files here. And then I can have a fuzzy search to, for example, if I want to go back to the init.toml file. And so if we go back to the MySpace Vim file, I can show you what that kind of customization looks like. So if we were to search, I can literally search for just that specific customization here, and you'll see that I have that mapped down here where actually I think I customized it a bit. Unfortunately, my what happens with your MySpace Vim is as you see in mine, it might get a bit messy. However, uh, uh, you'll see here I have various mappings. For example, there's another plugin called Vim Clap here that does similar functionality. In that case, it's space LH, and it'll bring up a similar type of thing. So there's always many ways to to do things in Vim, as you can see, and that can be both a pro and a con. However, I just wanted to show you what this kind of look like. And so when you want to come in here, again, because we're using space, you'll see oftentimes you can actually just use space as a leader. And then this is where the kind of magic happens with customization and key bindings. You can kind of come up with what makes sense for your fingers and what feels right when you're trying to bring up commands. And so uh, just in speaking to that, I think I wanted to talk about how some of my favorite plugins, I think, would be what I showed you, for example, is the ability of Vim to have these really nice things that you potentially don't get the same ability, or it's not quite the same when it comes to other IDEs like PHP Storm or VS Code. You can try and replicate it, and they tried you out of the box, but there's just so many great tools available out there. Like, for example, if I have this file browser where I can fuzzy search for files, and then it's going to show me a preview of the file, even as you see on the right here. And so I know exactly what I'm looking at before I even go there. And so I'm just like a huge fan of both that kind of customization, but the reason I encourage people to start with Space Vim is because they can really not have to reinvent the wheel from the ground up, which it can often feel like when you're first starting out with something like Vim. And so that's really what I'm trying to emphasize here with this talk. So I have a few other things I wanted to talk about. And again, I apologize for not having my slides ready here. I will provide those links after the fact. If you are new to Vim, you of course don't have to use something like Space Vim. Just like anything else, it's just a distribution. It's open source. It's out there. I find it as a good launching pad for getting into Vim, but some people might be purists, especially if you've been using Vim for years. You might have your configuration built up. That being said, if you have been using Vim for years, it shouldn't be too hard to directly import your own Vim RC configuration into SpaceVim using that MySpaceVim file and the functions they provide to load those in beforehand. And so even if you're already an advanced user, it really shouldn't be too much of a stretch for you to give SpaceVim a try. And so I think the takeaway for just this quick little talk today is that I think Vim, just like any command line tool, can be very intimidating at the start. And so it definitely requires some patience. If you are new to this, I would definitely take a weekend to build up a little bit of tactile memory in your fingers, getting used to hotkeys and things. before diving in. You might not want to try and start using Space Vim on Monday morning when your team is expecting you to work on a PR and you're trying to be productive. You have to give yourself some space, but um, I I'd like to think I'd like to promise that if you give it time, your keyboard can become just like any other musical instrument in that the more you practice with something like Vim, it basically becomes just like playing the guitar. You can build up your chops and you'll get faster and faster. And what I found personally by using Space Vim and then using that as a launching pad into the wider open source world of Vim plugins that we've kind of only scratched the surface of today is that it really speeds up your development and almost becomes indispensable. I've, for example, tried to go back to other IDEs like VS Code recently, and while I can make use of it if I need to, it just doesn't quite scratch that itch of customization once you're used to it. Once you build up that tactile memory and build up this library of custom key bindings that really work for you and how your mind thinks, it's really hard to want to accept a tool or a text editor that forces you to think in its way. I think the beauty of Vim and Space Vim is that if you invest the time up front, it really becomes an extension of your hands, just like someone who masters a musical instrument, and you can really express yourself uh, on the keyboard, similar to a musical instrument. And maybe that sounds really flowery or or whatnot, but I found it, really helpful for me, and it's only encouraged me to dig deeper into underlying command line tools. Uh, and other such projects as well outside of Vim, just command line in general, shell scripting, just and using Space Vim as a way to jump into that whole world of kind of getting more comfortable in the terminal itself in general, I think is a great way for anyone looking to check that out. And so I would just summarize today's talk as, saying that Vim will, in my mind, always be cool, just like playing the guitar, for example, but it can also be really hard to learn, just like the guitar. And so Space Vim, the distribution, is going to teach you the basics as well as give you a solid foundation to then experiment with and then build upon. And so pretty soon you'll be playing your keyboard at stadiums and arenas all around the world, you know, uh, with a huge audience. And so with that being said, I'd like to thank you for listening in today, and I'd like to leave just a few minutes now. I think we have around 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes for any questions or or discussions or suggestions you might have or for working in command line or Vim in general. So with that, I can probably just stop sharing screen for now. But if you'd like to raise your hand, and let me know if you have any questions, please feel free to use the raise hand functionality. I see someone's already raising the hand. I see a couple. And so I'll try my best to go in that order. So I saw Lisa, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, as the first to raise their hand.
At least.
Hi,
Um,
Elise.
so my question is about, I was just looking at some of the plugins you have, and I noticed there was one connected to Simple Note, which is an app that I use. And I'm curious, I just want to hear more about that one.
Yeah, so Simple Note, for those who might not be aware, is actually, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Lise, is a app written by the Automatic company, the same company behind WordPress, and is a great simple note-taking app. And so, yes, that one piece of advice for Vim for anyone out there is honestly what I found, for example, with Simple Note in this case, was I'll often just let's say I'm using Simple Note, and I'll just ask myself, is there a Vim plugin for that? And so Google will often be your friend in terms of asking, just searching Vim plugin blank. And I think that's how I came upon the Simple Note plugin. And uh, what that does is that it basically provides, I haven't used it in a while, so I don't want to try and bring it up, but just to address it specifically for you, Lise, is that Simple Note has a GUI interface, but for someone like me who's used to living in the terminal, the nice thing about who wants to stay, for example, in Vim, doesn't have to leave to another app. Oh no, I have to. I don't want to exit. I don't want to exit my precious terminal. So there is a Vim Simple Note plugin out there that basically allows you to set up to synchronize your actual Simple Note notes that get stored on the cloud on the Simple Note server, and allows you gives a nice little interface to be able to edit, create, edit, any Simple Note notes that you might have, but staying within Vim itself. So yeah, I think next up I saw Benji with their hand raised here. Benji, you want to unmute?
Hi. I wonder if you have something good for PHP that does like code completion and hints and understands the class structure and all the auto includes and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. I can briefly share my screen again and show you. So that's kind of what I spoke to earlier. So when you first install SpaceVim, if I show you that file explorer, or rather if I show you where that's located locally, it'll be in your local users folder. So again, you'll get your .spacevim.d folder, and this is the basic init.toml file. And this is what really attracted to me to SpaceVim at first, especially because I started out, I'm doing more JavaScript nowadays, but I did start out doing PHP because I've been doing Drupal for many years. And that's where I've met Benji and many great folks in the community. And so here, I'd like to argue that it's as simple as adding these two lines to your init.toml file. So what this will do is enable a couple different plugins for PHP. And if you're worried about doing that, I'd encourage you to go to spacevim.org, the website, but specifically there is a page on the site here where they explain the layers, and it can be a bit hard to find sometimes, but if you search for available layers, basically spacevim.org/layers, and I can post these links online, but this explains some of the basic things that are available to you out of the box that you don't have to use. A lot of these won't be enabled by default. That's the kind of beauty of it. If I don't need to work in Haskell right now, or or MATLAB or anything like that. So none of that's going to be enabled out of the box, but it's there for you to use if you need it without you having to go elsewhere and searching for it. So just to speak to Benji's specific question, they actually have a whole nice documentation page on PHP, what you get out of the box. So you'll get things like auto completion, syntax checking. You'll get your go-to definitions for classes. Where, for example, I have a key binding setup where I'll hit space GD for my mind makes sense, go to definition, and that'll jump me around just like any other IDE. So you can drill down into those classes in Drupal, in your object-oriented programming, and also it does have its own language server protocol layer as well to provide even more in-depth IDE functionality. What language server protocol? It's kind of like a fancy name for basically like adding even more fancy code completion or on the fly linting and things like that. And that's also really easy to set up. I can show you. Sometimes they require you to install other packages, either by npm or things like that, but usually the documentation here is really great. For example, I can show you how that looks in my file. So LSP, language server protocol, that's what gives you, it's really kind of running like a background daemon or a server that's kind of doing that on the fly linting and code completion. And so I have my LSP running for HTML, PHP, JavaScript. I even have it running for shell files. And this is literally just file extensions. So any files, or not just extensions, but these are there's a list of languages that you can enable. But so I will have a background language server protocol running for any time I'm working in any of these languages. And that's just what I work in. That's the kind of great thing, is that you only have to enable it for what you need. But for example, if you work in Python, you could enable Python, and then you might need to install a more global pip in that case, for example, the Python language server. And what SpaceVim makes easy is that it provides that easy integration layer. So as long as you have your, in this case, Python language server installed globally, or for me, like I use the JavaScript TypeScript language server when I'm working in JavaScript and TypeScript. SpaceVim provides that great integration layer that is going to be able to call that in the background and be linting your files on the fly. But yeah, I hope does that answer your question, Benji? I can go back to that. I can share these links. I'll share these links out after the talk. If you check the Nerd Summit site in a few days, I'm sure the links will be posted there. Also, if you want to get in touch with me, I can share. I think I have. If you look me up on GitHub or my website, you'll find a way to reach out to me. I might also share my email in the chat later on if that's helpful.
Sure,
We have Jim. You had a question?
Yeah. So actually kind of expanding on Benji's stuff. So you're using an LSP, is that basically giving you kind of like regular PHP kind of code completion, or does that have higher level awareness of your Drupal project and like, allowing you method completion and things like that, even in inherited objects? Is it helping with any of that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's really where the language server protocol stuff comes into play. And it was hard for me to wrap my mind around at first, like as well when I first started getting to Vim. I mean, you may be more knowledgeable than I was at the time. But for example, I first started out in PHP Storm, and from there, all these things are kind of configured by default. In that case, it's designed for PHP, so it's going to have all that deep linking. But what I found frustrating about PHP Storm and kind of what like drove me towards Vim was that I'd open up PHP Storm just to open up a Drupal code base, and my laptop fan would start spinning like crazy. All of a sudden, PHP Storm is taking up this crazy amount of memory, and it would take long to load, and it would just be an uncomfortable experience. And so what I found is that Vim, because especially with SpaceVim, you can enable just what you want. You might not need everything. I think like that, something like PHP Storm or even VS Code tries to get you. I think VS Code is good middle ground, but in terms of trying to be that same kind of in between just a bare text editor and a full IDE. But that being said, Vim can be that full IDE with that full IDE experience with those like kind of deep linking of classes, but without the kind of unnecessary overhead. And but also it's pretty easy to enable. Kind of like I was speaking to Benji's question earlier. What I like about SpaceVim is that instead of having to go out and grab all these plugins by yourself for auto completion or things like that, you can just get started with this simple adding 2 lines to your init.toml file. You can of course go and add other custom plugins. Like as you saw earlier, I have a whole bunch of other kind of contributed plugins that I've added. For example, here's a Vim PHP namespace plugin, and if you're trying to dip your toes into it, what my experience was is that it's hard to know exactly what you'll need until you get into it. I think if you start, like, I would encourage you to just try going into SpaceVim, enable the initial PHP layer. And if you're finding, oh man, I wish I could do this, and if it's not there already, chances are there's a plugin for it. And so like, that's just what I encourage. Like, don't worry about getting everything enabled at once. I think the layers are a great starting point. And then I would encourage you to, see what's lacking, and then Google's your best friend. Just, Vim plugin blank. I think I have another plugin for PHP auto importing of classes, for example. That's not something that's in the I maybe at one point used that. I'm not sure if I'm using it now currently or not, but there's things like that where if you want to be able to auto import classes, there's plugins out there for sure.
Have you played at all with like PHP Actor or Factor, as people might pronounce it?
I have a bit. I know I haven't used it in a while. There's definitely a Vim plugin for that. Kind of similar to like the Drupal mantra of like there's a module for that. I think there's there's also a Vim plugin for that too. And I think was there a specific question you had about that?
Oh, I just kind of want to
quickly?
see how, so when I used to do a lot of Drupal work with Vim, and that was like, for me, because that would handle auto imports and namespaces and things like that. So I was having a lot of luck with that. That was the closest I got, but it's like the setup you have sounds like it might be even better. But I can drop a link. There's like a couple things you need to do if you want to look at PHP Actor. I don't know if you're interested in checking that out at some point and comparing it to your setup, but I can drop a link in the chat about how you could set that up too.
Yeah, if anything, I'd have to. I haven't dug into the documentation for on SpaceVim, but I think like either PHP layer might even already grab that, like include PHP Actor by default, or if not, I think for some reason it's familiar. I remember I'm seeing that come up. Just by way of example, I can show you, instead of just this, the other nifty thing is that just like modules, there's often updates. You might want to get the latest code. So there is a built-in command. If you want to update SpaceVim itself, as well as any plugins you have installed, you don't have to go to Git to ever do any of these things. You know, as long as you have all your plugins listed in your init toml file here. So like we see, I have all my custom plugins here loaded in here. If I want to run update, I have a custom key binding for this, but I believe it's just sp. There's a couple core commands, sp for short for SpaceVim. So if you just run space sp update, you have a key binding for that too. I have it bound to space v up to update my Vim, and it'll show you. It'll just quickly go through and it'll go through pretty quickly, check all 177 plugins I have. That's the kind of beauty of it. You can have as many plugins or as few as you'd like. And of course, like themes and whatnot as well. I have this theme is the you see here is like the shades of purple themes. I happen to like purple, so you know, things like that too. But what I love about SpaceVim is that just makes updating like that really painless. And when it does that too, it just has that integrated plugin manager. So it's going to go get the latest code and then run any post download commands as well. You know, sometimes these plugins have some extra build steps after the fact. And so that's why it might hang for a bit. If you're using SpaceVim, you might see it. Currently, it's still updating, and that means usually there's something that's taking a bit longer to update locally. In this case, something failed to update, so it then automatically retries though. So Vim Fugitive failed to update at first, but then it says, and then it hopefully tells you, okay, all your plugins are updated now. It took just under a minute, basically. Yeah. So yeah, thanks, Jim. I couldn't see. Does anyone else have any questions? Benji, do you have another question? I see your hands raised, but not sure if that's from
sorry,
before.
no, I just didn't lower it.
Yeah, if anyone else doesn't have any questions, I think we're at time. So again, apologies for not having the slides here. I will make sure to share out those slides and links. And I posted my personal email there. Please feel free to get in touch with me if you'd like to email about this as well. But I'll make sure that my slides get posted with these various resources and everything linked out there for y'all. So thanks very much for listening in, and hope you have a good rest of the day.